Hi there, I'm George Michell, amateur musicological sleuth, obsessed with tracking down the influence of Johann Sebastian Bach on composers and musicians since his day to ours. It's an amazing story of 250 plus years of transmissions, transcriptions, and transformations, and it's still going on. No other classical composer of the past, whether it be Mozart, Beethoven, or Wagner, has exhibited such long-lasting magnetism, captivating the imaginations of so many later artists. It's a long and fascinating story, and I plan to tell some of it in this series of podcasts, each of which focuses on what I'm calling the afterlives of one of Bach's famous works. In this, the 8th of my Back to Bach podcast series, I'll be visiting the ever-popular Brandenburg Concertos. But before listening to some extracts, let's investigate the name Brandenburg. To seek the answer, we need to follow Bach on his journey to Berlin in 1719 to purchase a new harpsichord for his princely employer in Köthen in central Germany. In the Prussian capital, he meets Margrave Christian Ludwig of Brandenburg, a close relative to the Prussian king, as well as a music-loving aristocrat with a private orchestra. 2 years later, he sends the Margrave 6 concerts, as he calls them, for diverse instruments as samples of what he can do. There is no response, no commission. In fact, the scores that Bach sent to the Margrave end up in the Prussian State Library, where they are discovered in 1849 by a librarian who noted Bach's dedication and so decided to publish them under the name Brandenburg. Little could that Berlin aristocrat ever imagine that his title would be immortalized by Bach's music. The 6 pieces that Bach sent to the Margrave conform to the standard concerto grosso format of the period. That is, a piece with 3 quick, slow, quick movements played by a group of soloists backed by a string ensemble. In fact, Bach wrote each of his 6 Brandenburgs for a different group of soloists. Here are the solo violin and 2 flutes warbling away at the beginning of Brandenburg number 4. You will have noticed that the cheerful music of this concerto grosso has a prevailing dance-like rhythm. The same is true of all the Brandenburgs. No wonder that soon after their discovery, they delighted audiences, even those unfamiliar with Bach's other music. At this point, we should keep in mind that Bach did not invent the concerto grosso, but because the Brandenburgs rapidly became the best-known representatives of this type of concerto, it was Bach's examples that came to influence later composers to write their own concerto grosso-type works. Take Edward Elgar, for instance. Soon after hearing a performance of Brandenburg No. 3 in Germany in 1904, Elgar's friend, August Jaeger, suggested that the composer produce a brilliant scherzo such as Bach could write. Within a year, Elgar complied with his introduction and allegro for strings, featuring Brandenburg-like contrasts between a solo string quartet and a string orchestra, even though the music doesn't sound like Bach. Intent on forging a connection with Bach in this work, Elgar introduces a vigorous skipping fugue in the middle of his allegro, something Bach never did in the Brandenburgs. It turns out to be Elgar's most substantial contrapuntal exercise. For Paul Hindemith, the Brandenburgs served as a model for his Kammermusik or chamber music series that he conceived for small ensembles in 1926 and 1927. Number 5 begins with a Brandenburg-like regular pulse for the strings before dissolving into a solo part for the viola intended for Hindemith himself to play. Let's now return to the Brandenburgs and listen to number 6, with its overlapping phrases written for strings alone that create a continuous web of sound. These overlapping patterns attracted Igor Stravinsky, who imitates them in his 1937 concerto in E-flat, nicknamed Dumbarton Oaks, written for a small orchestra with woodwinds and horns. Hear how Stravinsky begins in Bachian fashion, with overlapping, interlocking figurations propelled by a steady pulse. As he was to confess in later life, the first theme of my concerto is, of course, very like Bach's. Now for something quite different. Here is some of the music that the Estonian musician Arvo Pärt wrote in 1977 for a concerto grosso type work that he called Tabula Rasa. This features 2 solo violins playing interlocking figurations to achieve a transcendental effect set in a wash of string sonorities. Or what about Alfred Schnittke's Concerto Grosso No. 2 of 1985? This begins like a parody of one of the Brandenburgs with overlapping string phrases until interrupted by chimes and percussion. Quite a contrast is this Bach-like dancing fugal movement for an orchestra of cellos in the Concerto Grosso-like Bachianas Brasileiras No. 1 of Heitor Villalobos, dating from 1930. And to finish off, what about the gentle dislocation of Bach in Brandenburger, Keith Emerson's 1968 irreverent take on Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 for the English progressive rock band Nice? While there's an abundance of wrong notes in the electric keyboard and guitars, Bach's spirit is by no means extinguished. Once again, it's been a pleasure to share these back-to-Bach journeys with you, my listeners, in which we've explored ramifications of the ever-popular Brandenburg Concertos. If you want to hear and learn more, you need only tune into the next episode.